People pay hundreds of pounds a night to sleep here now. But what they don't expect is that the previous tenants are still buried beneath it. This building opened as a reform prison in the 18th century, one of the most progressive and humane in Britain at the time. But it didn't last. It became overcrowded, violent, and for the worst offenders, lethal. 55 prisoners paid the ultimate price for their crimes, most of those in public, but in some cases for crimes that we can't even be certain that they committed. After death, many were buried quickly and unceremoniously in unmarked graves on the prison grounds, and so they don't appear to be resting in peace. To this day, despite millions being spent on transforming this derelict prison into a luxury hotel and visitor attraction, people still report things that they can't explain. Shadowy figures languishing in long empty cells, footsteps and voices calling your name when no one is around, and even physical attacks from something that nobody can see. Bodmin Jail may now be one of the most luxurious prison stays that you can pay for, but its dark and deadly past is still very much present. And when you hear what went on here over its 150 years of service, the ghost stories stop feeling like just stories. And it all starts in the later half of the 18th century, at a time when some higher-ups in Britain were finally starting to admit that the state of the prisons was a problem. Because at the time, prison was basically a hellhole. Overcrowded, filthy, disease-ridden places where men, women and children, regardless of their crime, were all locked up together. Just straight up suffering. But then along came John Howard, a prison reformer who really just shone a light on how awful these places were, which led him to push for new standards for how prisons should operate humanely. Yes, okay, these people have broken the law, but there's got to be some sort of minimum standard for care, you know? His recommendations were taken seriously enough to eventually be written into law, but a lot of prisons actually ignored them initially, because who wants to spend money helping criminals have a nicer time in prison? But one of the counties that didn't ignore the new laws was Cornwall. And at the time, Cornwall's main county jail was still at Launceston, but it was basically more medieval dungeon rather than 18th century prison. And I'm talking literally. Prisoners were seen chained up together, being cooped up in cells with dirt floors, and their food was thrown down to them from a hole in the ceiling. And that's kind of beyond just needing a new lick of paint. They really needed a brand new jail from scratch. Parliament gave Cornwall the go-ahead in 1778, and the town of Bodmin was chosen over Launceston because it was seen as clean and airy, great for attempting to keep disease to a minimum, but also because it was more convenient to get to serve the courts. Bodmin did already have its own little prison anyway, a small bridewell and a sheriff's ward, basically a holding prison for petty offenders and debtors, but it was not great. Just to give you an idea, the long gone prison is now where the Hole in the Wall pub is, named after the actual hole in the wall where food was passed to prisoners from the outside. Yep. So the plans for the new county jail were drawn up to replace this bridewell and sheriff's ward too. Sir John Call, a military engineer, he oversaw the construction of the new jail at Bodmin, which took 20,000 tons of granite mined from nearby Bodmin Moor. But the people who did the actual constructing itself, it was built by French prisoners of war, captured during the Anglo-French War that had begun the previous year. In 1779, the brand new Bodmin jail was opened though, and it was originally designed to house 100 inmates, and true to John Howard's vision, it was built to be remarkably nice in the context of an 18th century prison system. Prisoners each had their own cell, there was running water and ventilation, and men were housed separately from the women and children, because yeah, children were still imprisoned. A lot of them came to Bodmin because their mothers were prisoners there and they had nowhere else to go, but others actually were convicts themselves. There was a record of a boy aged 6 who was imprisoned for vagrancy, so basically being homeless. But other perks of this brand new jail were that you'd get to have a bath every 3 months. They even had an infirmary with reports saying how kind the surgeons were to prisoners. Just unheard of. Even so, with all of that said, before you pack your bags and devise a plan to get yourself imprisoned in Bodmin jail in the 18th century, it's worth saying that they were good conditions for the standard of the time, but still, you know, dire. Bodmin also had more of a focus on reforming prisoners into functioning members of society rather than just locking you up and forgetting about you. And I'm not talking group talking therapy geography, maths and English classes to get your GCSEs or anything like that, a lot of prisoners were sentenced to hard labour as part of their reform, where you'd be expected to complete 8 hours of brutal, physically demanding work like walking on the treadwheel, basically the 1700s version of a stairmaster, where you'd constantly be having to climb the stairs as the wheel turned. So you know just how many stairs you were actually climbing during that shift. A week's work would have you climbing at least the height of Mount Everest. Similarly, there was the crank, where you just have to turn this heavy lever for hours on end. Or you might have to do oakum picking, where you'd have to pick apart the fibres of old ropes from a ship with your bare hands, which would have left your fingers cracked and bleeding. But as time went on, Bodmin had to adapt to the needs of Cornwall at the time, and so this place that had been built with prisoner welfare in mind soon turned into something else. Something a lot more unpleasant. During the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century, when Britain was fighting France almost non-stop, ordinary people were hit hard financially, and so crime rose across the country as people became more and more desperate to not starve. In Cornwall specifically, this led to more and more people being sent to Bodmin jail, which was struggling to cope with this increased demand. Those cells that had been built for just one prisoner to live in eventually had 3, sometimes even up to 5 inmates crammed in there. And these spaces aren't that big to begin with anyway. But this overcrowding continued to get worse, especially after Launceston Jail closed in 1829. Extensions and additions had been added to Bodmin to try and accommodate more prisoners, but by 1850 it was clear that something dramatic needed to be done. The prison just wasn't adequate in its current state, and so another new prison was built on top of the original Georgian building. This new Victorian version of Bodmin Jail was ready in 1861, kitted out to house 220 inmates. Again, the recommendations that prison reformers had been pushing for were taken into account, but again, in context, still a prison. You can't exactly make it look like crime pays and that you get a cushy stay in a hotel, which is ironic considering how this story ends, but there you go. Bodmin was still a place that you didn't want to find yourself, because back then, imprisonment itself wasn't the punishment like it is now. Being in prison was where they would keep you so that you could be punished. For some, that meant the hard labour. But then for others, their punishment could be more permanent, because they could be sentenced to death. During the earlier part of the 19th century, there was what eventually became known as the Bloody Code, where over 220 different crimes could land you a death sentence. Criminals were condemned for violent crimes like murder and highway robbery, but also things like forgery or burglary. And a lot of the crimes that would send you to the gallows involved the food chain. So if you were a poacher, if you stole livestock, if you pinched farmers' crops, if you did anything that affected the supply of food, that would be enough to seal your fate. But at the end of the day, the threat of the noose wouldn't be enough to stop people whose only alternative was to starve. Not that that was the only motivation for some, because in 1813, 20-year-old Elizabeth Osborne was executed for setting fire to a cornfield. The motivation behind this arson attack wasn't super clear, but some thought it was revenge, as this cornfield belonged to a farmer who had previously employed Elizabeth before letting her go 3 years prior. But whether something else happened and that was just the straw that broke the camel's back, I don't know, as 3 years is a long time after being sacked. There was also another prisoner executed for his crimes involving livestock. In 1834, a William Hocking was executed for relations with a farm animal. Yeah. So that's horrendous. Throughout Bodmin's time as a prison, 55 prisoners were executed and 8 of those were women, but not all of them died on site. Up until the early 19th century, executions were actually held just down the road on Bodmin Common at St. Lawrence's, but then they went and built a county asylum on the site where these executions took place. So they instead started hanging the condemned just outside the main south wall of the prison, which was beneficial to the public because it meant that crowds could come on a lovely day and perch themselves on the hill opposite and see everything, as we will find out a bit later on with a couple of specific cases. But that was until 1862, when John Doidge became the last man to be hanged in public outside of Bodmin Jail. He was also the last man at the prison to be executed using the short drop method, which had started to be widely criticised for being a ridiculously inhumane way to go. And the more I cover these stories, the history of prisons, the more I can't help but imagine what it must have been like for those condemned prisoners prisoners being held there. They would have felt that ice-cold rush of adrenaline, knowing that the moment is coming, knowing that there's no appeal left and no way out. This is it. Being led out in front of a crowd of thousands, not because they knew you, but because they wanted to see what was about to happen. And then as it unfolded, you stopped being a person anymore. You were just something there to be observed. Some would look away disgusted, others would be leaning forward to get a better look, and some would be watching with complete apathy or maybe even joy at witnessing your demise. And it makes you wonder what those final days must have felt like, and whether that kind of fear, pressure and anticipation that the condemned would have been feeling would ever really leave a place like this. But after public executions were abolished in 1868, the last 4 took place behind prison walls using the slightly more merciful long drop. And that's where the length of the rope was calculated based on the person's height and weight, so that when the trapdoor opened, it would end things quickly rather than dragging them out. It was considered at the time to be the more humane option, because your sentence was death, not suffering and then death. Whether that actually is the case or not, no one is alive to tell us. And that's not even getting into the instances where the drop wasn't calculated properly. But much like other prisons at the time, if you were sentenced to die at Bodmin jail, your punishment didn't end once you were dead. You'd be taken down after an hour, and if you weren't dissected by medical students or left in a gibbet, you would be buried in an unmarked grave on the prison grounds. The reason being, you couldn't be buried in a consecrated church graveyard or reunited with your loved ones after you'd passed, anything like that. Oh no. This was to deny you of peace in the afterlife. You would forever be trapped behind the prison walls. And so to this day, there are still the bodies of some of the prisoners buried here. Some were buried in the coal yard, which is now the hotel car park. Others were in the allotments to the back of the building. And then there were more against the old west wall of the Georgian prison. So perhaps that's why we're going to be talking about some of them a little later on. And while these condemned prisoner graves were built over and forgotten about, Bodmin jail continued to evolve. In 1877, the county jail was officially renamed to HM Prison Bodmin. But that wasn't the only change, because the women had been moved out of their specific wing to make way for none other than the Royal Navy to move in. Yeah, the old women's wing became the naval wing, where they would imprison sailors for crimes like desertion, breaking leave, smuggling liquor onto the ship, or using said liquor and being found drunk or asleep on duty. And the reason that they'd taken over this wing was that they needed more space above what their Plymouth prison could hold, and they hadn't wanted their sailors being imprisoned alongside civilians, so they'd got their own separate wing. But civilian men and women continued to be imprisoned at Bodmin going into the 20th century. However, it wasn't only prisoners kept behind those high, solid stone walls, because during the First World War, the place was chosen as a safe location for significant documents like the Doomsday Book, as well as records from way back to the 12th century. You know, pretty priceless, irreplaceable documents about how the monarchy ran the country in the 1100s. But in that early 20th century, the writing was kind of already on the wall for the future of the prison. Inmate numbers were dwindling, less and less criminals were being sent here, and so there wasn't such a need for a huge facility like Bodmin anymore. On the 13th of March 1911, the last of the women prisoners were transferred out to HMP Plymouth, and the civilian men followed in June 1916. Even the naval prison, that was handed back to the prison commissioner on the 31st of March 1922, and the jail was officially decommissioned on the 18th of March 1927. And that was that. Nearly 150 years of confinement, punishment and death came to an end when Bodmin jail closed its doors on life as a working prison. Countless criminals had passed through those gates, and not all of them had walked out again. The building was actually auctioned off after it was shut down, and demolition men had the winning bid. They took down the smaller buildings, stripped anything of value to sell on, and the only reason that the rest of it is still standing to this day is because when they attempted to demolish it so that they could reclaim the materials to sell on, they actually couldn't. They used a bunch of dynamite, but it didn't work properly against the solid granite that the prison had been built out of. Instead of breaking up into nice chunks of rock that could be sold on, the dynamite turned it into useless rubble, and so they gave up. Instead, in the 1930s onwards, the old prison had a bunch of uses. The owners did try setting up an attraction staging mock executions, much to the distaste of locals, and rightly so, really. The last execution had been in 1909, so not a super long time ago by that point. Probably more than a few living relatives still close by, so you know. But it was also used as a fishmonger's, a car garage, a badminton court. And then there was also a nightclub casino cabaret venue that opened up in the old prison chapel called the 99 Club, with the tagline, "The clink with a drink." Catchy, I will give you that. And while it was a brilliant venue for people looking for a great night out, there were other people who remembered their time there less fondly, as though the previous tenants hadn't moved out. Because some nightclub staff and visitors heard disembodied footsteps, sometimes the clanging of a bell, or if they were really unfortunate, a deep guttural voice right behind them. Only when they turned around, there was never anything there. One witness claimed that while he was at the 99 Club one night, he saw with his own eyes a tablecloth get ripped off the table that it was on, where it proceeded to fly on its own halfway across the room. Obviously, that is not a normal thing to see, so he went over to investigate, make sure no one was pranking him, but there was nothing there. No fishing wire, no explanation, just nothing. Oh, already getting a bit ghostly on you, and we haven't even gotten to the end of the history yet. In the years since its last prisoner left, though, other non-human residents have also moved in. Huge populations of bats made the old prison their home, living inside the plaster of the walls. They've even got rare bats in there too, so if you do feel like you're being watched in the prison or you see shadows flitting about, might not be what you think it is. Bodmin Jail became a Grade 2 listed building in 1969, and fast forward to the 1990s, it opened up as a museum where visitors could take a look around. In 2021, it reopened after a £65 million investment to turn it into pretty decent visitor attraction as well as a boutique hotel. Actual parts of the prison were transformed into 70 hotel rooms by knocking 3 prison cells through to make one room. And actually, having been there not that long ago, unfortunately we didn't stay in the hotel, but we did do the attraction and sampled the bar, and yeah, it is really nice in there. The attraction itself includes the only working execution pit in the UK, which was actually discovered in 2005 and fully restored. The last 2 prisoners to be executed actually died here in this very spot, Valeria Giovanni in 1901 and William Hampton in 1909, and remember that last name. But that brings us up to nowadays. It's a hugely popular spot with people coming from all over to experience the prison. From the luxury of the hotel rooms to the harsh reality of what prison life and death would have been like, but also what came after that. Because Bodmin has a reputation as one of the most haunted prisons in the country. They regularly host ghost tours and paranormal investigations. TV crews have been there, including a particular Most Haunted, which is a very significant thing for reasons that I will get into before I finish talking about Bodmin. But if the stories are to be believed, it makes sense for the paranormal to be such a huge thing here. I mean, when you just stop to think about all of the misery and suffering this place has seen, the emotional turmoil, the pain and the death. This place was created to be humane, to offer reform, and then what eventually happened with overcrowding, it's a lot. So much so that I had to split this episode up into 2 parts, as there were just so many ghosts to tell you about. And they start as soon as you enter the attraction. So if you've never been, first of all, if you ever get the chance to, definitely go. It's been set up so brilliantly. But you first go through what they call the Dark Walk, and it's this great big immersive showcase of crime and punishment in Cornwall. When you're the only people walking through, like Mr. DSC and I were, it is creepy on its own. Forget the ghosts. But as the name suggests, it's very dark, and the first 2 rooms are set up a bit like mines, which makes sense given how central mining was to life in Cornwall. But it's in this second cavern room where you may notice something a little strange, because some people have witnessed what looks to be a tall, beastly looking shadow man standing in the darkness, stooped over, looking all crooked. Sometimes he's described as grinning, but not in a nice way. He looks menacing. He shuffles about around the outskirts of the room, and sometimes people hear this shuffling when they know that everyone in that particular group is standing still. Hence, he's been given the nickname Mr. Shuffles. They'll turn around expecting to see a straggler who's tagged along to the end of the group, but there's no one there, and only a super uneasy feeling like they're being watched. But you may also want to hold on to your valuables, as he seems to take a shine to jewellery. People will feel necklaces and bracelets drop to the floor as the clasp inexplicably comes undone. Earrings will just randomly fall out too. If that happened to me, forget Mr. Shuffles. You do what you gotta do, bro, but I have 20 piercings in my ears. I am not losing all that jewellery. So just shuffle past me, I'm finding that metalwork. As you continue to walk through this attraction, you'll get to a big room that's set up like Bodmin Moor, where it talks about a few infamous crimes, and specifically a woman called Selena Wadge, who we will be getting onto in just a bit. But in this room, it's located not that far away from where 8 people were executed publicly between 1834 and 1856. And so it's thought that that's the reason why this room specifically has a very dark, foreboding atmosphere in it, which has nothing to do with the projections and the visual effects. But staff members, when they're opening up for the morning or closing down at night, sometimes they'll hear their names being screamed out at them in this area. Obviously, you instantly think that something is wrong, your colleague needs help or something, but there's never anyone around. Your colleague might be on the other side of the prison. Oh, I would be making sure that was a super quick walkthrough if I started feeling any kind of vibe. But moving straight through to the final room of the Dark Walk, it's all set up like a courtroom. So this walk, you've seen all the crimes being committed, and then you get to see the judgment being passed. It is honestly really brilliant how they've done it. But in this room, the lights will flicker randomly and without explanation. Seriously, they've had their electrician take a look at it countless times. There's no reason he can see that the lights should be misbehaving. And tour guides who are bringing a group through this area will commonly count 2 extra people who seem to have joined mid-tour. But when they leave the room, those 2 people have gone again. And the reason that tour guides bring visitors back through this room, though, is because it was the prison's infirmary and morgue back in the day. A place where prisoners would have been sick, in pain, and some would have passed away and been stored before they could be buried. So you already know, if any spot in a haunted prison is gonna have a vibe about it, this is probably a good contender. But once people have finished the Dark Walk and they go out to the ground floor of the naval wing, that's all set up to show you what it would have looked like as a prison. And here is where you may come across other entities. One of the most famous said to still be trapped in the prison is that of Selina Wadge, the prisoner who you're introduced to on the Dark Walk. In life, Selina had been a very poor single woman with 2 illegitimate children, 6-year-old John and 2-year-old Harry. To keep her and her children from starving, she was very often in and out of the workhouse. That's the sort of poverty we're talking. But then she met a soldier called James Westwood, and the pair started a relationship. Things seemed to be going well, and there was even talk of an engagement on the horizon. And on the 21st of June 1878, Selina left the workhouse, saying that she was off to go and visit her fella James and taking her 2 kids with her. Only when she returned later on, with just her eldest, John, people were suspicious. Hello, where is your 2-year-old child? Selina said that Harry had fallen ill while they were away and had died suddenly, which is tragic, yes, but no one questioned her. She was known as a caring mother, and loss was all too common at that time. Until little 6-year-old John had told a workhouse nurse that Selina had actually put Harry in a quote-unquote pit. Well, I mean, the story had been shaky anyway, but after the little boy had said that, massive alarm bells are ringing. Kids don't just say things like that with no reason, you know? The workhouse superintendent and his wife, who was the matron, they went back to Selina the next morning and questioned her again, and she completely changed her story. She said, "No, you're right, Harry hadn't taken ill at all. No, my boyfriend, James Westwood, he'd taken him from me. He was responsible. He told me that if I said anything or tried to stop him, he would do the same to me and John too." Well, I mean, that was it. You've said something like that. The police were immediately called and an investigation was launched. But while the police were out looking for Selina's youngest son, she confided in the matron again, changing her story for a 3rd time. She admitted that she herself had caused Harry's death, saying that she had acted out of fear that James would abandon her. The only reason she did it was because James threatened that he wouldn't marry her otherwise, so she said. Which sounded like the closest thing to the truth that they'd heard so far, really. She'd been living for so long as a single mother during that time period. James probably could have said anything and she would have done it to get that wedding. After some searching, Harry's body was recovered from the bottom of a well. It seemed as though John had been telling the truth all along. Selina was arrested and James Westwood was questioned, but when asked how he felt about Selina's kids, he said that he had absolutely no ill will towards them whatsoever. At her trial, Selina was found guilty, but even the jury recommended that the judge show mercy. There was no evidence that this had been premeditated or anything like that, but the judge, he was not lenient at all, and he sentenced Selina to death. But even as she was imprisoned in Bodmin, locked up in the condemned cell with her death sentence looming over her, people were still expecting a reprieve to come through. But the Home Secretary, the only person who could intervene, he stated that he did not see fit to interfere with British justice and so the date was set, the 15th of August, 1878. There hadn't been an execution at the prison for 16 years before Selina, but they weren't leaving anything up to chance. William Marwood himself was brought in to carry it out. Marwood, in case you don't know, was the man who had developed the long drop method of hanging. Selina's last words were recorded as being, "God deliver me from this miserable world," before she died, aged 28 years old. She was the last woman executed at Bodmin Jail, but it was also the prison's first private execution and the first to use the long drop. She was, like other prisoners, buried in an unmarked grave, but to this day, people have encountered a female spirit who many say is Selina. She seems to appear to children very often, with many of them turning to their parents and asking who that lady in the long dress is, who's crying. But the parents, they can't see anything. Pregnant women will all of a sudden break down in floods of tears, being overwhelmed with feelings of guilt and remorse, as though they've tapped into how Selina was said to have been feeling. Interestingly though, a lot of sightings come from hotel guests near the area where she was executed, which is now part of the hotel. But some people believe that if the ghost of a crying woman is seen, it's actually not always Selina Wadge. And as bleak as it is to say, this wasn't rare. There were many women executed for infanticide up and down the country. And so another woman, sometimes linked to these sightings, is a prisoner called Elizabeth Cummins. She was a servant working in a large house, but she wasn't particularly a model employee. She had a fling with another servant and she fell pregnant, but she did her utmost to hide it from her employers. Even going so far as when she went into labour, she excused herself from the room that she shared with another servant, saying that she was having bowel issues, and went out to the cowshed to give birth alone. When the baby was born though, she didn't want any attention drawing to herself, and so in a panic she made an awful decision. It was a decision she was never going to get away with, and in 1828 she was executed just outside the prison walls. Honestly, some of these stories of the crimes that these prisoners committed, they're just so heavy and awful. I really don't know how true crime channels can do this day in, day out. I know I talk about death a lot, but they are just on a whole other level. And some people believe this next haunting may also be tied to Selina or Elizabeth, but others think that no, it must just be one of the many children who were imprisoned here over the years, because visitors and staff sometimes feel their clothes being pulled at, as if a small human is trying to get their attention. There was also a story about how the duty manager, when they're going about the prison unlocking for the day, they may feel a cold hand slip into theirs when they're all alone. No children were executed here. I think the youngest was 17, which is still absolutely no age, but I mean, thinking about it as a child, being in Bodmin Jail, that's going to be a terrifying time for you. That would be a lot of energy and fear being in such a scary place. No wonder if some remnant of that energy is still there, it would look for comfort, right? But elsewhere in the prison, if you encounter a shadowy figure with a pronounced limp, you may have just come across another infamous inmate, because this entity is thought to have been a long-gone prisoner called Matthew Weeks. Back in the mid-19th century, Matthew would find himself at the centre of one of Cornwall's most infamous murders. He worked at a farm just on the edge of Bodmin Moor alongside two other live-in servants, including 18-year-old Charlotte Diamond. Charlotte was described as very pretty and charismatic, whereas Matthew wasn't exactly described as good looking, and he walked with a pronounced limp. And yet, he and Charlotte had begun seeing each other. Something that, because Matthew had supposedly just come into a bit of a decent inheritance, whereas Charlotte was an illegitimate child, she was kind of thinking about securing her future, but we don't really know. But the servant girl was said to also have a bit of a flirtatious nature, and this had supposedly caught the attention of another guy, the farm owner's nephew, Thomas Prout. On Sunday the 14th of April, 1844, Matthew and Charlotte were seen going out for a walk together across the moor. When Matthew appeared back at the farm later though, alone, suspicions were obviously raised. Matthew said that Charlotte had actually gone and got herself a new job, and so that's where she was. He had just been walking her some of the way to her new place, and so that was that. But a few days later, Matthew's Sunday shirt, his Sunday best, what he would have been wearing the last day that Charlotte was seen alive, was found to be torn, missing buttons, and bloody. Okay, now something's really not adding up here. The household was already really growing suspicious. They decided to check out Matthew's story, and so they went to the farm where he'd claimed that Charlotte had got the new job. No, don't know what you're talking about, mate. There's no job on offer here. Haven't seen a girl called Charlotte. Now that's really odd. But it took a whole other turn when they got back to the farm to find that Matthew had done a runner. Well, okay, that's not a good look, and so a search was organised, combing the moor day after day, hoping at first that Charlotte would be found alive. But 9 days after she disappeared, the search party made the discovery that they'd been dreading. Charlotte's body was found on the bank of a river near Rotor, with poor Charlotte found and Matthew gone, as well as the state of his clothes and the shaky explanation. Suspicion obviously quickly fell on the farmhand. Matthew was eventually discovered hiding in his sister's house in Plymouth, and he was taken back to Bodmin to stand trial for Charlotte's murder. It took just over 30 minutes for the jury to find him guilty, and so he was sentenced to death. While he was waiting for his sentence to be carried out, he had 2 letters dictated, as he was illiterate, he couldn't read or write. But one of these letters was said to be a confession, saying, yeah, he did it. And part of it reads, "I hope young men will take a warning by me and not put too much confidence in young women, the same as I did. I hope young females will take the same by young men. I loved that girl as dear as I loved my life." I mean, those are very eloquent, well-articulated words for a man who couldn't read or write. But at midday on the 12th of August 1844, Matthew Weeks was executed. An estimated 20,000 people had gathered to watch, with many of them having followed every detail of the case in the press for weeks beforehand. It was all anyone was talking about in the area. But once it was over, his body was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison's coal yard, that area that's now the hotel car park. But that wasn't the end of it. Even nowadays, people argue whether Matthew actually did it at all. It's true that his conviction was based on circumstantial evidence, and that confession letter, lots of people weren't actually convinced that those were Matthew's own words. But with his trial, it was like there was this rush to get things done and dusted. People in the area had already made their mind up about him, and the trial was just a formality. So much so that there was a memorial stone put up at the site where Charlotte was found, which read, "In memory of Charlotte Diamond, who was murdered by Matthew Weeks." The memorial stone was put up 1 month before the trial. So yeah, there's a lot more to this case. A lot of people have spent a lot of time researching what truly happened, and it's a case that continues to divide people, with some thinking that actually the farm owner's nephew Thomas Prout may have had something to do with it instead, but then others are still firmly in the camp of, why did he run away, why were his clothes torn and bloody, and why did he come up with that story? So yeah. But now, this limping figure seen around the prison is thought to be Matthew. Whether he's unable to rest because he's protesting his innocence, whether it's because his guilt keeps his spirit restless, suppose that depends on how you feel about the case. But on the other side of this too, Charlotte Diamond, it's said that she now haunts Bodmin Moor, because a young woman wearing a long gown with a red silk shawl and a bonnet has been seen walking in the area where she was discovered, which, yeah, that's what she was last seen wearing. That was her Sunday best. But back at Bodmin Jail, there are plenty more stories of tormented prisoners still haunting the building. And sometimes you might see 2 of them together. In the newer end of the naval wing, and you'll know it's the newer end because of the red line on the wall, visitors have seen 2 men standing in the corner watching. Your first assumption is that maybe they're costumed staff members, maybe even super realistic, creepy mannequins, but when you meander over towards them, they disappear. Nowhere for them to have gone, you would have noticed. And they're believed to be the Lightfoot brothers, William and James, who, in life, fancied themselves as highwaymen, until one robbery turned violent and left a man dead. It was back in 1840, 23-year-old James and 36-year-old William were lying in wait for their next victim. They had turned to robbery to make some quick cash, and they had their sights next set on a man called Neville Norway. He was an incredibly wealthy timber merchant, which the Lightfoot brothers knew, but they also knew his route home. On the 8th of February, they stopped him and demanded his money. Neville fell from his horse, where the brothers proceeded to take his money before beating him to death. Not long after, Neville's horse was seen tearing down the road with no rider. Hang on a minute. That's that businessman's horse. The horse was eventually found outside Neville's stable with blood on the saddle, no sign of Neville. His body was found later, and no one had a clue who could have done this to him. And so for a while, it looked as though whoever was responsible might get away with it. But a £100 reward for information was announced, and that changed things. All of a sudden, people started coming forward with bits and pieces, and the same name kept cropping up again and again: Lightfoot. The pair were eventually found and arrested, and while they were locked up, each brother tried to save himself by blaming the other. Just lovely characters, neither one wanting to take responsibility. And I mean, everyone could see through what they were doing, and So at their trial, the jury only took 5 minutes to find them both guilty. And the jury's decision really just reflected how the public felt about this awful crime. Everyone's sympathy was with Neville Norway's family, and over £3,000 was raised for his widow and 6 children, an enormous sum for the time. And that kind of says a lot about how well liked Neville was in the area. For James and William though, unsurprisingly, there was no such sympathy. The pair were executed side by side on the 13th of April 1840, which was a spectacle in itself. An estimated crowd of over 25,000 people had gathered to watch them hang. And there was such a huge demand to see the execution that trains travelling along the nearby railway stopped on the tracks so that over 1,000 extra spectators could watch. Just really going to show how people were desperate to watch public executions at the time. It was this day out, a morbid attraction. After it was done, the brothers were buried next to each other in unmarked graves, alongside what was the women's wing at the time. Years later, when the prison expanded, the women's wing obviously became the naval wing, and when the naval wing was extended, it was built straight over the top of them. Which means that today, if you're walking through that newer part of the naval wing, you could be standing just 3 feet above the bodies of William and James Lightfoot. Yeah, they're still underneath there. Maybe try not to think about that too much while you're reading the information cards and taking your photos. But as you move around the rest of the attraction, at the end, you'll get to that very foreboding execution area. The one that was discovered in 2005, containing the working trapdoor and where 2 men were executed. And it really is an area out of the whole attraction that makes you feel a certain type of way, knowing what happened there just over 100 years ago. Knowing that both Valeria Giovanni in 1901 and William Hampton in 1909 would have been directed to stand on those trapdoors so that their sentence could be carried out. And you can read about crime and punishment in history all day long, but standing in a place where it actually happened is something else entirely. The atmosphere in there is heavy. It just sits on you. But sometimes it goes beyond more than just a feeling, because the phantom sounds of footsteps on creaking wood have been heard, even though the entire area, other than the trapdoor, is solid floor. People then claim to hear the unmistakable sounds of rope being tightened. There aren't any sound effects in that area, as far as I know. There's no explanation for what multiple people have encountered. But some tour guides claim something far more disturbing in that area. While leading daytime heritage tours, they've reported suddenly feeling as though a rope has been placed around their neck, followed by a rush of air as if the floor has dropped away underneath them. I think I would be hysterical if I encountered that. The feeling of that rush of air? Nope, no thank you. They say that that sensation passes quickly and then they're back to normal, but for the rest of the day, they're utterly, inexplicably exhausted, completely depleted of all energy. They've got nothing left to give. And I think that, out of all the different physical sensations that people have claimed to experience throughout my time researching for this channel, that has got to be the most horrific to encounter. Down in the basement though, where those prisoners would have dropped through the trapdoors into, the activity is just as bad, because William Hampton himself, the last man to be hanged at Bodmin jail, is said to haunt this area. He was convicted of murdering 16-year-old Emily Treadry after she called off her engagement to him. Utterly heartbreaking. Made even worse by the fact that her 9-year-old brother witnessed the attack and ran to go get their mum. What an absolutely awful thing for that poor little boy to have to go the rest of his life having seen that. The jury found William guilty, but they recommended mercy, only it never came. More than 3,000 people also signed a petition asking for his sentence to be reduced, but it was denied. And at 8 AM on the 20th of July 1909, William Hampton was executed. His body would have been transported through the basement on its way to the morgue, and that's the same area where people now report the most activity. But he's not the only one lurking down in the basement of Bodmin jail though. There's something else down there, and some believe that it isn't entirely human. And that is where we will pick this story back up in part 2. But for now, I feel like you probably need a breather, because that is the history and some utterly disturbing crimes tied to Bodmin jail. Wow, that got dark. I hope you're doing okay out there. Some of these crimes were absolutely vicious. And when we're talking about them just in the context of a ghost story, it can be really scarily easy to feel detached from them. But that's the thing, these weren't just stories. They involved real people. This stuff actually happened. Real suffering and death took place here, and that doesn't mean forgetting what put those people there in the first place. But really, when you look at the sheer amount of pain that this building has seen, it's not hard to understand why so many people believe that there's still something lingering here. And I'll save the rest of my thoughts for the next part because there are loads more ghost stories to get into. So if you appreciated this episode, I know it still feels weird to say liked after something this heavy, but giving the video a like really does help. And if you haven't already subscribed, make sure that you do so you don't miss part 2 when it goes up. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go and get a drink of water, stay hydrated even in this cold weather. I'll be back next week with some more of your stories, and thank you so much to everyone who's sent in their ghostly encounters so far. They have been utterly enthralling to read through. Honestly, some of you guys have witnessed terrifying stuff. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Are you coming to say hi? Wait, I can't touch you with that hand, because if I do, Chris will shout at me. Oh, you dribbled on me. Gross.